You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Welcome, Sacred Sofa listeners, and hello, Brad. And we'd like to welcome back Karla Drader, spiritual director and associate pastor of Nexus Church. Hello, Karla. Hello, Brad.
Yes, hello, Karla and Grace. Delighted to have you with us, Karla, as we continue to explore the good and flourishing life. So welcome back, Karla.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
In this episode, we'll be exploring something that is a universal human experience, something that we've all come across in our lives, loneliness. And Karla, you're going to be taking the lead as our guest on this episode, but you've upped the intrigue by coming at this topic in a unique way. You address the problem by starting at the end, offering a solution in the love of God before actually unpacking the heavy emotion and state of loneliness.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important starting point. God's love is the beginning and the end, you can say. That's what the love of God as revealed in Jesus is to me. It undergirds everything, lighting up my hope, my faith, my own love. And it just allows me to show up more fully for myself and others when I would otherwise probably just stay in bed a lot more than I do. So the whole series of 6 sermons that I've got is based on a book, Reaching Out, by the Dutch Catholic priest and author Henry Nouwen. And as I sat with that book, it just seemed clear to me that we needed to begin with God's love. And I think that's really infused in all of Nouwen's writings, because it just allows us to face the challenging realities that Nouwen starts with. And the first being this gnawing sense of loneliness.
Yeah, what intrigued me, Karla, about your approach here is you start with Jesus addressing a question that's posed to him. He is asked, of course, what is the most important commandment? And his response is, of course, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, why did you choose to start there?
These verses are really foundational, simple, clear, and rich with so many wonderful implications. And it mirrors Nouwen's writing, these directions that our heart is reaching out to. So Jesus shows us how our love for self and others and God is all intertwined. And it's just inextricable from one another. And I find that both super encouraging and super challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, but it is not immediately obvious to me anyway, how this speaks to the problem of loneliness. So how do we connect the two? Can you take us into that?
Yeah, well, it's connected, I think, to reaching out, which is the title of that book, right? Loneliness is the signal to us that we have some reaching out to do, or actually that our hearts are already reaching out. So the 3 areas we can and need to reach out in are towards ourselves, towards others, and toward God. So I just find it really encouraging that growth in one area helps us grow in the others too. So like when we grow in grace and generosity towards our loved ones and our enemies, we will find it easier to love ourselves and will likely feel much closer to God. So when we're compassionate to ourselves, we'll find more grace for others. As we draw near to God, we'll feel warmer and more open to others and to ourselves. So it all kind of works together. But then by the same token, when we're hateful towards our neighbors, we're acting destructively to our own souls and to our relationship with and ability to perceive God. And that actually feeds our loneliness. So a scarcity mindset here keeps me from reaching out. Like a scarcity mindset would ask something like, how can I love God with all my heart if I'm also called to love my neighbor as myself? There's only so much love to go around, right? We separate it. We see it as kind of different, limited, but love is not a finite resource. And if anything, it's like a magic well that keeps refilling because it's fed by the source of all things. It keeps replenishing it the more you draw from it. So loving others is like loving God. Loving ourselves helps us love others. It's all connected.
I love that idea, right? That we don't need to have a scarcity mindset around love and connection,
Hmm.
though I confess that's often my default mode for sure. It sounds good to me, but something I think really hard to put into practice. But maybe it might be helpful for us to step back for a moment and talk about loneliness and why we
Hmm.
feel lonely. And this
Mhm.
feels particularly important to talk about at the moment because I just ran into some rather disturbing stats. It's about men in particular, though I don't think the experience is particular to men, but it's not a male phenomenon. But consider some of these recent stats I ran into. They come from the American Survey Center. In 2021, 15% of men reported that they had zero close friends. And that alone is frightening. But if you compare it to 1990, so what's that, 30 years prior, that number was only 3%. So over the past 30 years, we've seen the
Well,
numbers rocket, right? In 2022, 60% of men under age 30 were still single, which might not be a problem, but it sort of speaks to this, okay, having trouble forming relationships maybe. And even more
mhm.
jolting, in a 2023 survey, men aged 18 to 45, the majority of them, over 15%, agreed with this statement: no one really knows me. And I just find that tragic. And again, it's not a male phenomenon, but it simply
Hmm.
highlights, I think, for me, how deep of a problem this is. So, could maybe
Mhm.
each of you speak to exactly what we mean by loneliness and maybe why you think it's becoming more prevalent?
Hmm. Hmm. I'm not actually surprised about those numbers because I often hear from women they're concerned that their male partner doesn't have adequate social connections and also how difficult it is for them to connect with
Hmm.
other men. So I'm not exactly surprised by the stats, even though it's sad and tragic. And, we'll be speaking to that in this episode is how do we lean in rather
Hmm.
than, lean away. I'm also hearing more and more from clients who are struggling to find ways to meet new people, both platonically and romantically. Loneliness can be described as a sense of perceived social isolation. It's a pervasive feeling, a sense of isolation, and it's not the same as being alone physically, but we can intensely feel lonely even surrounded by others. And we can still feel that deep sense of disconnection and isolation.
And now it calls it a strange inner gnawing, right? That's a terrible feeling.
Absolutely uncomfortable feeling, but yet it's a universal experience. And I think the problems arise when we try to ignore or deny the feeling of loneliness, when we try to engage in other sorts of distractions, staying too busy, consuming, shopping, socializing, everything we can do to avoid confronting and sitting with that feeling. I also think the harm lies in the fact that these are merely temporary fixes. They don't actually address what's underneath, which is the genuine need for connection.
Hmm.
And Karla, you've in the past done a comparison between this emotional feeling with a physical hunger to illustrate not only the importance of addressing what's happening in our physical body for its optimal health, but also the emotional needs we have are just as important. And so, just as ignoring your physical hunger can lead to health problems, ignoring our social hunger can actually lead to quite negative consequences, as seen by even the research you shared, Brad.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of spaces where we don't have a chance to express or even give time to notice the range of our feelings, right? But
Mm-hmm.
just like hunger prompts us to eat, loneliness prompts us to reach out to others for social connection and also to reach out what might sometimes feel much further to God for a spiritual connection.
Mm.
Hmm.
Loneliness
Hmm.
also invites us to reach out to our own hearts to see what they're needing. So it's about acknowledging and understanding our loneliness. But lots of us have shame around our loneliness. We don't like to admit to it. We don't want anyone
Mm-hmm.
to know. And that actually makes it much harder to address. If we can, though, recognize it as a signal and a reminder of our deep seated natural human need for connection, that can build bridges instead of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. I think that's a good point, Carla. Like, there's something just the stigma around saying out loud I'm lonely.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just not something mentioned often in polite company, right? And so but it's there, and there is a stigma around it. But it seems that as we're becoming more culturally aware something's wrong, and perhaps we're lonelier than ever. But when we
Mm.
talk about reaching out for social connection or spiritual connection, what does that practically look like? How do we go about doing that?
I'll just say briefly, it's not always easy, especially when we're thinking about fear and past hurts that will hold us back or become barriers. But even small interactions like greeting a stranger, sharing a smile as you're walking about, or chatting with someone at the bus stop can be surprisingly powerful. And Karla, I think you have a couple of examples you wanted to share with us. Please do.
Yeah. There's just this kind of small moments. And I think for me, I've noticed that I actually need to face that I need these
Mm,
moments.
mm,
And because we can go about our day and feel like, well, I just don't have enough, to share with other people. I can't be there for
Mm.
them. But what if I need this, right? So just this one time I was out running, and actually a couple times I've crossed paths with a group of the most adorable toddlers you have ever seen. The first time, just as we started to pass each other, they broke into a run. The whole group of these little kids started running and laughing, and the one in front yelled out, "We're running!" And I just had time to say, "Yes, me too. We're running." It was just so simple and joyful. And then 2 days later, I passed them again. Both of us were running. I was running. This time I said, "Look at you running." And just everyone smiling, even their straight-faced guardian shared a smile with us. So it was
mhm,
just, this little connection that filled my soul. Maybe theirs
mhm.
too, right?
Mm.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, and then I'm thinking about like shopping at Costco. That is not, a time when I'm necessarily most open. I'm
Ugh.
on a mission. I'm trying to, yeah, get in, get out. But sometimes I've noticed having these little encounters with people. So like people ask for advice over a product or share their shared love. They bond over the shared love of a certain olive oil or something. And it just does call you for an
Mhm,
openness when I'm not really feeling it necessarily, but I choose to connect, and then the whole place feels warmer to me.
mhm, mhm,
So when I notice that I need this, and then, realize that, okay, this other person needs it too, and these minor, insignificant or interactions are so much more important than we think. And
mhm,
I actually found a study that says we tend to consistently underestimate and misunderstand the good potential for both sides in these little social interactions to our
Mm.
detriment. So we actually predict we'll feel better keeping to ourselves. And then we're missing out on these little mood boosts throughout the day because we're
Mm.
afraid that it actually will take something from us.
mhm.
But the people in this study who expected to feel better keeping to themselves actually reported a significantly more positive experience compared to those who stayed isolated.
Mhm.
Mm, that is fascinating, right? Yeah, these little mood boosts that you can get. And I certainly know the feeling. For me, I am perhaps no surprise one of those people who likes to keep my head down in Costco, interact with no one. But it feels like there's a lot, right, working against us in this regard. I think it's never been easier to stay isolated while sort of feeling maybe quasi connected, right? Like you could be at home on a Friday night feeling lonely, but you got your streaming services, you're on social media. We've never
Mhm.
been able to at least remain more distracted or entertained, maybe while feeling alone or lonely. And yet it would seem that maybe these things are maybe making the problem worse. I don't know. What do you all think?
Mhm. Mhm.
It
I would
sure
say
seems like it
too.
is. And
Mm. Go ahead,
yeah,
Karla.
go ahead, Grace. Well, I think we still somehow keep returning, right, to
Mm.
these things, even though we're getting not great results. We're sort of hopeful in a weird way that we will, but we don't.
Mhm. And I would agree too. Avoidance actually feeds into this bigger problem of loneliness when we try to outrun it by staying busy, buying things, chasing our validation online, as you talked about, Brad, and social media. It just never really works. And actually, for most people, makes them feel worse or more isolated, more less included. And to lean into understanding what loneliness is and facing it. It's not about grand gestures, but just being willing to connect, to step outside our comfort zones, even if it feels awkward and uncomfortable.
Mhm. Well, and I think it's actually the fear of awkwardness, at least for me, that keeps us closed in, even when
Mm-hmm.
what we need is more connection, right? Our hearts are reaching out constantly. We just have to embrace the cringe.
Hmm. Well, now I'm with you both here. I love this, but let me throw this out there. Is it maybe harder for some people to make connections than others? Are some people just better at it than others? I mean, I'm sort of thinking, along those classic introvert, extrovert lines. And also, I don't know if it's just my sense, but it feels like over the COVID lockdown, some of us lost some of our social skills. It just, I don't know, kind of disappeared, which seems to me to be a real problem here for those of us who struggle to make social connections or find it cringy, painful. What might be some ways we can start to work out those connection muscles?
Mm-hmm. I think something that can help is to remember that we're all in this together. Everyone experiences loneliness at some part of their journey of life, even if they don't show it. When we approach others with that same understanding, inviting compassion and humility, we can actually create a space for genuine connection. It takes effort for sure, and it's a journey, not a quick fix. And so you got to lean in with intention. And I think it helps to find what works for you. We're all different and unique, so we're not going to all have the same strength, ability, and even desire in the same way. And so got to find what works for you. I think the key is to remember that we're not alone, we're in it together. And even taking small steps towards connection can make a huge difference. Fight that fear of trying to avoid the awkwardness. Again, we're all there, right? Allow ourselves to be vulnerable, be brave, and lean in towards each other rather than moving away just to isolate ourselves.
Mm. Yeah, by facing our loneliness, right? Now and says we allow it to become a place of transformation rather than this gap we need to stuff full of something, anything, and quickly. We can see it as an opportunity, a space where we can meet with God, cultivating inner peace, connecting with God and ourselves, and then others. Think of
Mm-hmm.
it as creating a space within yourself where you feel comfortable and at peace, nurturing a healthy relationship with yourself, which then in turn allows you to connect more authentically with others and where you can receive God's love more easily, more fully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
A lot of this sounds like how important mindfulness is in terms of our own experience, because it strikes me that without that, the deck can seem stacked against us in so many ways. And Karla, when you taught about this, I believe you mentioned some research that suggested that loneliness actually triggers like a self-preservation mode in the
Mm-hmm.
brain, and sort of in
Mm-hmm.
that self-preservation mode decreases empathy, it disrupts sleep, it increases defensiveness. And all those things add up to make reaching out even harder. And so I think if we're not aware of what's going on in the mind, it can be easy to, well, again, the deck is stacked against us. So when we get caught in that vicious cycle, how do we break out?
Well, I think a big step toward it is, like you said, like being aware, realizing that this happens, just and catching ourselves in those patterns and meeting ourselves with compassion when we do get caught up in that. And then realizing that loneliness is not a disease to be cured. It's a signal, an
Mm-hmm.
invitation, and we
Hmm.
can respond to that signal.
Hmm.
Yes, yes. Mindfulness for the win, people.
Oh.
The antidote to loneliness is community.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, in large part. And it's not the whole story though, because loneliness is natural and it's always going to be there to some extent, right? Community will never take it away completely. So
Mm-hmm.
when we see it as normal and natural, and when we know ultimately that we are loved by God, we can face it with courage, compassion, and curiosity. And that just requires facing of ourselves first. So we start to pay attention to our own patterns, like when do we get hit by that feeling the most?
Mm-hmm.
Just consider like scrolling on social media, shopping sprees, at church, at work, in certain relational interactions. What's going on there? And we might want to consider trying something else, moving in a different direction. When we listen to our hearts, we might hear our hearts asking for connection when we feel the urge to browse on Amazon.
Hmm.
I know that when I'm like, I gotta shop, I got the urge to
Hmm.
shop, I need to do something creative instead. That is
Mm-hmm.
like what that's asking for. And then we can also start to notice a few things now and mentions that increases our sense of loneliness. And the first is comparison and competition. We constantly measure ourselves against one another and we're seeking that external validation. So then other people, instead of becoming community, they become competition.
Hmm.
And so we're seeking affirmation instead of that connection.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I like what you said there in terms of noticing when we feel that emotional need of loneliness to be filled, not seeking the quick fix. This when you compared it to physical hunger, it reminded me of, asking yourself as you're heading to the fridge for another snack, am I
Hmm.
actually hungry or do I need something to drink? Is
Hmm.
my body
Yeah.
actually thirsty? And so, taking that time and space to be mindfully aware of what is this I'm trying to fill with something that's not going to benefit me in the end. And to your point about comparison, that's a shaky ground for our self-worth, always trying to measure up to someone or something. And so, you know, trying to fill that loneliness void with likes and followers instead of real connection, it's going to
Hmm.
leave you quite dissatisfied.
Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, because we're hiding behind masks, right? And then that was that question, right, Brad, that from the stats, like I don't feel fully known or seen.
Mm.
But it's actually often us who is afraid to be known, and that prevents us from forming deep connections.
Hmm.
And then another thing that can increase that sense of loneliness is the belief that others can take away our sense of loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Karla, can I just hit pause on that there? Because it
Mm-hmm.
almost sounds a bit counterintuitive. I mean, isn't that exactly what you were saying? We need others to combat that. So this, yeah, take us deeper into that because I'm intrigued.
Mm, right, for sure. But we do need others. That's clear.
Hmm.
But at the same time, no one person or thing can completely erase our loneliness. And when we kind of put the burden on like them to take that feeling away, we put immense pressure on them. So on our partners, friends, family to give us more than they have, more than they can. And we're expecting them to fix something that's ultimately an internal struggle. We're asking them essentially to be God to us.
That
Hmm.
is setting folks up for failure. That's a
Hmm.
lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot to put
Hmm.
on someone. You spoke to that in a previous episode too, Brad, in terms of
Hmm.
we have so much expectations on even our intimate partners these days. It's near impossible. Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think we really got to take that pressure off of our relationships and turn to God for the deep sense of belonging and wholeness. We just shift our expectations.
And how would you suggest then we move towards a healthier relationship with our own loneliness?
Well, I think recognizing first that we all have these different specific invitations in a given moment, but there are universal truths that can help us all. So, one of them is just like we've been saying, kind of reframing our understanding of loneliness as just our hearts reaching out. It's a natural impulse, it's not something to be feared or avoided. And when it shows up, we can take it as a signal that we need that connection. And that's the hard part because that signal is an invitation and that will lead us in different directions. So you do need a little bit of discernment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we need to reach out in ways that might even seem frightening and impossible, depending where you're at.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would say this is not about going big or go home. Sometimes we actually make it bigger than it actually needs to be. Can we just start somewhere? Say hello, send a text or an invite. When it comes to mind, just send the text, send the invite, pick up the phone, schedule a coffee date with a friend. If you're trying to broaden your social landscape, maybe enroll in a class or join the
Hmm.
club. Community centers are in most neighborhoods. And if you're comfortable in the digital realm, there's even online options to connect. Meetup.com, for example, connects people with same interests. So if
Hmm.
you like bowling, right,
Hmm.
the odds are you're going to find folks who are interested in the same thing. But, start somewhere, baby steps.
Hmm.
Mm. Yeah, so that is the kind of reaching out towards others part. And like I said earlier, sometimes loneliness will also invite us inward. so that we can explore the deeper parts of ourselves that we might be neglecting in the busyness of everyday life or that we're afraid to move towards. So loneliness, though, can be a catalyst for both inward and outward growth.
Hmm.
And like Grace said, we're all lonely. We're in this together. We need to normalize talking about it, taking away the stigma so people recognize their loneliness and feel comfortable reaching out. So like you were saying at the beginning, Brad, like we don't even want to say I'm lonely. But I think the opposite is also true. Like we don't want other people to say it to us. But when we take it off the pressure of like taking away their loneliness, well, maybe I could just go have a cup of coffee with you. Maybe I don't need to be your savior, but I could maybe hang out a little bit. So loneliness is extremely painful. It's life-sucking, especially chronic loneliness and isolation. I just think if we see it as a signal to pay attention and we approach loneliness with courage, compassion, and curiosity, it can slowly turn into a doorway.
A doorway to what, Karla?
Well, something pretty great. It's solitude.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Solitude. Okay. That doesn't immediately sound better, to be honest, especially for any extroverts maybe in the crowd. That's like, ooh, that's not great news. But I think I know where this is going, but you're leaving us hanging here a bit, Karla.
Got to come back next episode.
This has been very enriching, Karla, and it's great to have you with us again. We look forward to exploring together solitude in the pursuit of the good and flourishing life.
Wonderful. Thanks both of you for joining us. We'll see you next episode.
See you next time.